Hey there, sleepless rebel. Let me take over for a while. Tonight's story isn't about fairy tales or cozy nostalgia. It's about suburbia. The place where lawns are trimmed, neighbors nod politely, and monsters are definitely not supposed to live. Except one did. We're heading to Long Island, where the quiet streets of Massapequa Park hid a man the world would later call the Gilgo Beach Killer. By day, he was an architect. By night, prosecutors say he hunted. It took decades, 11 bodies, and a beach that turned into a cemetery before the mask slipped. So settle in. The story will move slowly, like the tide along Gilgo's dunes, pulling you deeper with every wave. There will be secrets, science, courtroom battles, and the uncomfortable truth that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like the guy in khakis at the commuter train. If you're new here, hit subscribe. I promise the nightmares are always served calm, steady, and just sarcastic enough to keep you awake. And if you're already part of this rabble, drop a like to feed the algorithm gods. Now for you, what disaster should we transform into the next story for you? Could be a scandal, a catastrophe, or some unsolved mystery that deserves a long, sleepless retelling. Leave your ideas in the comments. You never know which one might end up whispering in your headphones next. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to The Gilgo Beach Murders, a suburban nightmare. Let's begin. July 13th, 2023, Massapequa Park, Long Island. A date that slipped into the news cycle like a shark fin, slicing through calm water. Up until that morning, the biggest drama on the block might have been someone's recycling bin blowing over in the wind. It was that kind of neighborhood, predictable, quiet, the sort of place where you could almost believe crime was something that happened elsewhere. Then came the flashing lights. Police cruisers, vans, plainclothes officers moving with a kind of restless energy that says, this isn't a drill. For residents sipping their morning coffee, it must have felt like the opening shot of a TV crime drama. Except this wasn't cable. It was their street. The door of a tan, unremarkable house opened, and out stepped Rex Heuermann. Tall, broad, slightly rumpled, a man who looked like he'd be more comfortable at a drafting table than in the grip of detectives. Architect, husband, father, and now, allegedly, the Gilgo Beach Killer. The contrast was jarring. He looked like the guy you'd get stuck behind in a hardware store queue, not someone accused of murdering 7 women and scattering their remains along the shore. Neighbors stood on their porches in shock, phones raised, eyes wide. Some mouthed the word no. Others muttered, well, he was always strange. That's the suburban reflex. Retrofitting suspicion after the fact, as though a dislike for small talk was somehow a clue to multiple homicides. Handcuffs clicked, cameras flashed. The headlines wrote themselves, Monster in Massapequa. For more than a decade, the Gilgo Beach murders had hung over Long Island, like a storm cloud that refused to move on. 11 sets of remains were found along the coast between 2010 and 2011. 4 of them, dubbed the Gilgo Four, were discovered within days of each other. They had names, families, lives that had been cut short, and for years, no answers. Now, the man in the cuffs was accused of being the shadow behind it all. Prosecutors claimed 7 victims. Rumors whispered of more. The list was long enough to sound endless and yet incomplete. For investigators, this was a victory. A suspect, a name, a face. For the community, it was a betrayal. Because the monster they'd feared hadn't been lurking in some far-off corner. He had been living right here. barbecuing in the same backyards, shopping in the same grocery stores, blending into the very fabric of suburban normality. And that's the unsettling truth about monsters. They rarely look the part. They don't arrive with glowing red eyes or sinister cloaks. More often, they wear khakis and glasses, complain about traffic, and pay their property taxes on time. Heuermann was the banality of evil dressed in office attire. The arrest was only the beginning of the spectacle. News vans swarmed, reporters elbowed for position, and the quiet cul-de-sac became a stage. Every angle of the house was photographed, every detail picked apart. Did the peeling paint mean something? Was the overgrown patch of grass a sign? In the absence of certainty, people made symbols out of shadows. But as dramatic as the arrest was, it wasn't the beginning of this story. It was the culmination of years of silence, fear, and failure. To understand why this morning mattered, why neighbors gasped and families broke down at the news, we need to step back. Back to the shoreline, where the tide revealed its secrets. Back to the list of names that had become synonymous with loss. Because before there was an arrest, before there were mugshots and court hearings, there were victims. Women whose lives ended on the edge of Long Island, their voices silenced, their stories reduced to evidence bags. And that is where we must turn next. Before the arrest, before the mugshot became a meme of horror, there were names. Or to be precise, there were names for some, numbers for others, and for too many years, far too many of them were simply Jane Doe. If there's one thing bureaucracies do with eerie efficiency, it's turning people into case files. The 4 women found in December 2010 would become known as the Gilgo 4, as though branding them like a Netflix special somehow made the tragedy easier to digest. They were Melissa Barthelemy, Amber Lynn Costello, Megan Waterman, and Maureen Brainard Barnes. All young women, all in their 20s, all vanishing into the silence of Long Island's back roads before reappearing, weeks or months later, in the reeds and sand, wrapped in burlap, reduced to headlines. The discovery was almost cinematic. A police officer walking his dog near Gilgo Beach stumbled on human remains. One body, then another, and then, horrifyingly, another, until there were 4. A grim trail stretching down the coastline, each new find confirming what the community didn't want to admit. This was not random. This was not isolated. Someone was hunting. And it didn't stop there. In the months that followed, more remains surfaced. Jessica Taylor, partially dismembered, identified only years later. Valerie Mack, who went missing in 2000 finally. Given back her name through DNA in 2020. And then Sandra Costilla, murdered as far back as 1993. The earliest known victim tied to Heuermann. Her name was almost lost in the dust of history until prosecutors pinned it back into the timeline. But the horror wasn't only in the number, it was in the detail. Some bodies had been dismembered. Some remains were found miles apart, scattered like cruel breadcrumbs. Among the dead were Peaches, later identified as Tanya Denise Jackson, and a child, once only called Baby Doe. A mother and daughter, erased in life and left nameless for decades, until forensic science finally caught up. The cruelty of it is hard to overstate. Not just the murders themselves, but the long silence that followed, during which families were left to wonder, to hope, to dread. For the public, the numbers blurred. Was it 11 victims? 13? More? The count shifted with every press conference. To the families, though, the arithmetic never mattered. It was never about the total. It was about the empty chair at Christmas, the unanswered phone calls, The terrible moment when hope curdled into certainty. The victims' lives were more than their ends, but the world often forgot that. Instead, they were shorthand in crime reports. Sex workers, runaways, women living on the margins. As though those labels explained, or worse, excused what had happened. It's easier, after all, for society to process violence when the victims are kept at a distance. But behind each headline was a person, someone's daughter, sister, friend, whose story was rewritten by a man the prosecution would one day point to as Rex Heuermann. By the time of his arrest, at least 7 of those names had been officially tied to him. 7 charges, 7 lives erased. But everyone knew the math didn't end there. The unanswered cases still lingered, like ghosts waiting for acknowledgement. And so the arrest in 2023 wasn't just about one man in cuffs. It was about all of them. The women who never came home, the families who never stopped asking questions, and the cold files that finally began to thaw under the weight of new evidence. But to understand how the monster and the victims collided on that shoreline, we need to look at the stage itself. Long Island, with its sleepy suburbs and tourist beaches, was never meant to be the backdrop for a serial killer's legacy. And yet, it became exactly that. To outsiders, Massapequa Park always looked like a snapshot of the American dream, frozen in time. Rows of modest houses lined quiet streets, each with its own well-kept lawn and a mailbox that seemed to promise nothing more sinister than utility bills and pizza coupons. Kids rode their bikes in circles until the streetlights flickered on. Barbecues smoked through summer evenings. And the loudest disturbances were usually the fireworks someone insisted on lighting too early before the 4th of July. This was a suburb built to project normality. It was safe, or at least it felt safe. And in places like this, the feeling is what counts. It's the illusion of predictability that keeps people from checking over their shoulders at night. But illusions have cracks, and a Massapequa Park would discover just how wide those cracks could split. Rex Heuermann lived here like anyone else. A tall man, awkward in posture, often seen carrying work folders or muttering into his phone. Neighbors recall him as quiet, even dull. He wasn't the type to linger at block parties, though sometimes he would stop just long enough to share a half-hearted hello. If you passed him on the street, you might remember the glasses, the slightly stooped walk, the way he seemed weighed down by his own frame. But you wouldn't think monster. You'd think middle management. And that was exactly why he could exist in plain sight. Suburbs like Massapequa Park rely on conformity. Everyone has their role. The dad mowing the lawn at dawn, the retiree gossiping from the porch, the teenager sneaking out after dark. As long as you stay within the expected script, no one asks questions. And Rex stayed firmly inside the script. He paid his property taxes, commuted into Manhattan for work, kept his home unremarkable enough to blend into the scenery. It was camouflage by normality. Yet beneath the facade of order, the suburb was always more fragile than it appeared. Crime didn't happen here, people said, as though saying it out loud kept reality at bay. When a car was stolen or a break-in whispered through the grapevine, it was dismissed as an outsider's doing. Someone from somewhere else. Because to acknowledge the danger could come from inside the picket fences was unthinkable. That kind of horror belonged in the city, not on Long Island. And so when the arrest came in 2023, the shock was not just about the crimes themselves, but about the setting. The fact that a man accused of orchestrating such violence had been hiding among them all along. The suburb, once the backdrop for Little League games and PTA meetings, had suddenly been rebranded in bold headlines across the nation. The story was no longer safe community, it was hunting ground. The illusion shattered quickly. House prices dipped. Journalists crowded sidewalks with cameras. True crime tourists drove slowly past Heuermann's house, their windows rolled down, craning to catch a glimpse of the banal epicenter. The name Massapequa Park became inseparable from the Gilgo Beach murders. For longtime residents, it was like waking up in a town they didn't recognize. Their streets reduced to symbols of horror. Their suburb immortalized in documentaries they never asked to star in. And in the middle of this rupture sat the uncomfortable truth. Monsters don't live only in shadows. Sometimes they live in the house next door, blending in so perfectly that the illusion of safety holds until the day the sirens arrive. To understand how Rex Heuermann became that neighbor, the awkward man behind the facade, we need to step even further back. Before the mugshots, before the headlines, before the burlap sacks at Gilgo Beach, back to his beginnings, and to the early signs that would later seem, in hindsight, like cracks in the mask. Every monster has an origin story. In Hollywood, it's usually a cursed laboratory, a tragic childhood, or a radioactive spider bite. In the case of Rex Heuermann, it was Long Island in the 1960s. Hardly cinematic unless you find suburban sprawl thrilling. He was born in 1964, the same year the Beatles first touched down in America, though Rex's early soundtrack was less screaming fans and more the flat hum of fluorescent lights in school corridors. By most accounts, his childhood was profoundly ordinary. No bonfire of warning signs, no diary entries dripping with madness. He grew up in Nassau County, blending into the same grid of houses and routines that would later shelter his adult life. He was tall early, awkwardly so, the kind of kid who made teachers sigh when asked to stand in the back row of class photos. Shy? Perhaps. Socially smooth? Not exactly. The stories suggest someone who never quite mastered the rhythm of easy conversation. Schoolmates remembered him as strange, though strange in the suburban sense, which usually means quiet, not good at sports, maybe too interested in his own hobbies. In another world, that might have been the end of it. An awkward kid who grew into an awkward man, destined to complain about property taxes at town meetings. But hindsight makes everything look like foreshadowing. Once you've seen the mugshot, the memories shift. What once seemed harmlessly eccentric becomes chilling. He chose architecture as his profession, a career of lines, angles, and precise control. Fitting, really. A man who spent his days drafting office towers while, prosecutors allege, sketching something far darker in the margins of his life. Architecture requires patience, attention to detail, and an ability to plan. Unfortunately, those are the same qualities that make for a very methodical killer. As an adult, he settled into the very environment that had shaped him. Long Island suburbia. Married twice, father of two, daily commuter into Manhattan. On paper, his life was painfully average, almost aggressively so. It was the sort of resume you might skim over without a second thought. And that's the point. Because the most unsettling part of his story is not some gothic twist or explosive revelation. It's the dull predictability. There were no tormented manifestos in his youth, no dramatic criminal record pointing toward the abyss. Instead, there was the slow, steady accumulation of normal days, layered one on top of the other until no one bothered to look closer. That is the camouflage of the suburbs, normality itself. And it worked. For decades. Of course, once the arrest was made, every detail of his upbringing was dragged out and re-examined, polished into ominous anecdotes. The tall boy who didn't talk much, Clearly suspicious, the student who sat alone, practically a red flag, the awkward neighbor, a ticking time bomb. But the truth is less dramatic and more unnerving. Rex Heuermann's origin was not marked by fire or fury. It was marked by quiet sameness, the kind of life you barely notice. And that is what makes the story so disturbing. Because if a monster can come from here, from this bland soil of schoolyards and split-level homes, then where else might one be waiting? To see how that quiet ordinariness hardened into something much darker, we need to step into his adult facade, the family man, the working professional, the neighbor who waved politely before disappearing into his house. The mask that held for decades, until the day it cracked. By the time Rex Heuermann settled into adult life, he had perfected the art of camouflage. On the surface, he was exactly what suburban America loves to manufacture in bulk. The dependable family man. Married, then married again. Father of two. A commuter who caught the same train into Manhattan every morning, briefcase in hand, the sort of passenger no one ever remembers sitting next to. He was an architect, which sounds glamorous until you realize most of his work involved drafting plans for corporate spaces and unremarkable buildings. Not quite the next Frank Lloyd Wright, more like the guy who makes sure your office cubicle has the right amount of fire exits. Still, it was a job with status, enough to keep the bills paid and the facade polished. He wore suits that never quite fit, glasses that seemed a size too large, and carried himself with the clumsy gravity of a man who looked permanently uncomfortable in his own skin, which, ironically, made him even less noticeable. In the suburbs, awkward is invisible. His home life, at least from the outside, followed the expected script. A wife, children, the endless logistics of suburban family management. School runs, grocery trips, the occasional argument heard through thin walls. Neighbors described him as quiet, even dull. If he stood out, it was only because of his sheer size, 6'4" and broad, towering over the rest of the PTA crowd. But physical presence isn't the same as social presence, and Rex always seemed to fade back into the wallpaper once the small talk ended. This was the mask that works so well. Unremarkable stability. Nobody looks twice at the man who seems boring. Nobody suspects the guy who spends his weekends tinkering in the yard and grumbling about property taxes. And so Heuermann drifted along, blending into the suburban current, shielded by his own mediocrity. Of course, appearances deceive. Behind the family dinners and commuter routines, prosecutors claim a darker life was unfolding. Late-night internet searches for escorts, disposable phones activated and discarded, the sort of behavior you might expect from someone living a double life, but never from the man who waves politely as you drag your trash cans to the curb. That's the trick of the mask. It allows the unspeakable to coexist with the ordinary, without either collapsing under the weight of contradiction. His children, by most accounts, knew nothing. They grew up in the bubble every child deserves to believe in. That their father was simply their father, flawed but safe. His wife, Asa, surely noticed things, but hindsight is a cruel lens. After the arrest, she filed for divorce, unable or unwilling to reconcile the man she married with the monster in the headlines. And who could blame her? Sharing a home with someone accused of killing 7 women is not just traumatic. It's a complete demolition of the story you thought you were living. But perhaps the strangest part of Heuermann's mask was not how convincing it was, but how unnecessary it seemed. There were no dramatic disguises, no elaborate cover stories, just dull consistency. He hid in plain sight, and the world looked the other way. It's tempting to ask how nobody noticed. How could friends, family, neighbors miss the darkness simmering beneath the surface? But that question carries an uncomfortable answer, because they weren't looking. Nobody expects a suburban father to be a predator. Nobody scans the cul-de-sac for serial killers. The mask of normalcy doesn't need to be flawless, it just needs to be good enough to exploit everyone else's desire to believe in it. And so the family man carried on, year after year, his double life running parallel tracks. Office towers by day, secrets by night. Until the night bled into the headlines, and the mask finally cracked. But before it did, there was the darkness itself. The crimes that turned Long Island's beaches into crime scenes. The murders that shattered the illusion forever. To understand how his mask concealed so much, we have to walk back to where the trail of bodies began. Every story has a beginning, though in this case the beginning went unnoticed for almost 30 years. Before the headlines screamed Gilgo Beach, before the burlap sacks and the aerial shots of police combing dunes, there was Sandra Costilla, a woman whose life ended violently in 1993, long before anyone thought to connect her death to a man named Rex Heuermann. Costilla was 28 when her body was discovered in North Sea, on the east end of Long Island. She had been strangled, a brutal personal act that requires both proximity and intent. Her murder was investigated, of course, but like so many crimes of that era, it slipped into the fog of unsolved cases. There was no DNA match at the time, no suspect to pin it on, no smoking gun, just another life extinguished, another file collecting dust. For decades, her name hovered on the periphery of the story. When police finally tied Heuermann to her death in 2024, it was as if a missing puzzle piece had been belatedly shoved into place. But back in the early 90s, she was simply another victim, her story drowned out by the noise of larger headlines and the limitations of forensic science at the time. The 90s were not kind to women like Sandra. Cases involving young women, often struggling at the margins, were too often written off with a shrug. If the victim didn't fit the glossy image of innocence, media interest waned and public outrage dulled. People forgot. Authorities moved on. It was an era when predators could thrive in the gaps, shielded not by cunning but by society's indifference. And that's exactly what seems to have happened here. Whoever killed Sandra, and prosecutors now insist it was Heuermann, didn't need to be a criminal mastermind. He needed only patience, anonymity, and the knowledge that the world wasn't paying close enough attention. Her murder was real, immediate, devastating for those who knew her. For the rest of Long Island, it was a headline that faded quickly into the background. When the case resurfaced in court documents decades later, it was almost surreal. To think that the story might have begun not in 2010 with the Gilgo 4, but nearly 20 years earlier with Sandra. It reframed the narrative completely. Suddenly, the monster wasn't a product of the 2000s, but of the early 90s. How many more years had he been operating unseen? How many other files lay buried in archives, waiting for a new DNA test to connect them? Sandra's case stands as a reminder of the danger of hindsight. In 1993, her murder was just one tragedy among many. In 2024, it became a prologue to a nightmare stretching decades. If Heuermann was indeed responsible, then Sandra was not just an isolated victim. She was the first chapter in a story Long Island didn't realize it was already living. And the scariest part? Nobody saw it coming. There was no collective panic, no sweeping investigation into a potential serial predator. Just silence. The kind of silence in which monsters thrive. It would take nearly 2 decades and a dog walk on Gilgo Beach to shatter that quiet. Because in 2010, Long Island was forced to confront the fact that Sandra Costilla might not have been the only one. Far from it. After Sandra Costilla's murder in 1993, the case drifted into silence. Not solved, not forgotten exactly, just shelved. The kind of file that sits in a cabinet until the drawer sticks and someone decides to clean it out. For the people who loved her, the loss was permanent. But for Long Island, life carried on. And that was the danger. The 90s rolled on in their usual blur. Grunge music, AOL dial-up, blockbuster Friday nights. Suburbs like Massapequa Park moved with the rhythm of PTA meetings, commuter trains, and the occasional garage sale. People assumed danger belonged to the city, not the sleepy sprawl of Long Island. It was the perfect environment for someone like Rex Heuermann to blend in. Predictable streets, neighbors more interested in hedge heights than human mysteries, a police system not yet wired for 21st century forensics. If he was killing during those years, and prosecutors strongly suggest he was, the signs didn't scream. They whispered. Women went missing. Some written off as runaways, others dismissed as casualties of high-risk lifestyles. Every lost person became an entry in a database, another photo fading on a bulletin board. Individually, each case was tragic. Collectively, they were invisible. Technology didn't help. DNA analysis existed, but not with today's precision. Rootless hairs, degraded samples, partial prints, they often led nowhere. Digital footprints were almost non-existent. There were no smartphones broadcasting location histories, no surveillance networks in every corner shop. A predator could slip through the gaps simply by being ordinary. And ordinary was exactly what Heuermann did best. Meanwhile, Long Island's beaches kept their secret. Tourists strolled, families picnicked, and nobody knew what lay beneath the scrub and sand. It is almost unbearable to think of the contrast. Children building sandcastles within miles of places where human remains were hidden. Yet that was reality for nearly 2 decades. The police weren't blind, but they were limited. Missing persons reports piled up, but without clear connections or evidence, nothing held. The idea of a serial killer stalking Long Island simply didn't fit the narrative. Even when patterns were visible in hindsight, women of similar ages, similar vulnerabilities, disappearing without closure, the pieces never aligned. Or perhaps no one wanted them to, and so the years stretched on. One disappearance blurred into another. Families grieved in private, holding on to scraps of hope or surrendering to silence. Neighbors whispered about crime, then changed the subject to mortgage rates. The suburbs kept doing what they do best, pretending everything was fine, until December 2010. A police officer walked his dog near Gilgo Beach, and the silence snapped. What began as a routine search spiraled into one of the most infamous crime scenes in modern American history. The skeletons, literal, not metaphorical, began surfacing from the sand. And with them came the realization that the nightmare had been alive far longer than anyone admitted. It began, as so many things do, with a dog. In December 2010, a police officer took his German Shepherd for a walk along Gilgo Beach, a stretch of Long Island sand better known for summer crowds and fishing shacks than for secrets. The officer wasn't looking for bodies. He was looking for Shannon Gilbert, a young woman who had vanished after a panicked 911 call months earlier. What he found instead was the start of something much larger. The dog caught the scent first. Among the tangled reeds, wrapped in burlap, lay human remains. One discovery might have been tragedy. 2 would have been coincidence stretched thin. But as the officer pushed forward, he found another, and another. 4 bodies in total, lined like grim markers along the coastline. 4 women, abandoned within a quarter-mile stretch, their silence broken only by the crash of the winter surf. They became known, almost instantly, as the Gilgo Four: Maureen Brainerd Barnes, last seen in 2007, Melissa Barthelemy, who disappeared in 2009, Megan Waterman, missing in June 2010, and Amber Lynn Costello, gone that September. All in their 20s, all connected to the precarious economy of sex work, all erased in the same brutal pattern. The burlap bags were especially chilling. They weren't the improvised panic of a man trying to hide a single crime. They suggested planning, ritual, a method repeated with precision. Whoever left these women here wasn't careless. He was organized, deliberate, and disturbingly confident that the beach would keep his secrets. The media swarmed. Gilgo Beach, once just another name on a map, became shorthand for horror. Reporters descended with satellite vans and solemn tones, turning dunes into backdrops for nightly broadcasts. The phrase Long Island serial killer entered the public vocabulary, though no one yet knew who that killer was. For the families, the discoveries were devastating confirmation of what they had long feared. Each name announced was another future stolen. Another life collapsed into an evidence file. For the public, the details became macabre trivia. Phone records, escort ads, the eerie reports of calls made from victims' phones after their deaths. People debated these fragments like pieces of a crime novel, forgetting that behind them were mothers, daughters, sisters. The Gilgo Four were not the first victims, we know that now, but they were the ones who forced the world to pay attention. Their discovery ripped the lid off 2 decades of silence and hinted at a scale nobody wanted to imagine. Because if 4 women could be found within days of each other, how many more were waiting in the sand? The investigation ramped up, but the answers did not come quickly. Instead, the discoveries multiplied. Over the next months, search teams would uncover more remains along the barrier islands. Bodies dismembered. Identities unknown. Timelines stretching back years. Gilgo Beach was no longer just a crime scene. It was a cemetery. And with each new find, the pressure grew. The suburbs could no longer pretend. Long Island wasn't just a postcard of family barbecues and summer rentals. It was a hunting ground. But if the Gilgo Four forced the story into the open, the discoveries that followed would make it clear this was bigger, older, and far more terrifying than anyone first believed. The discovery of the Gilgo Four should have been the end of the nightmare. 4 women found, 4 families grieving, and a killer somewhere out there, ready to be caught. But Gilgo Beach wasn't finished speaking. The sands held more stories, and they were not neat or contained. They were scattered, partial, grotesque. In the months after December 2010, police widened their search. What began as a desperate hunt for Shannon Gilbert turned into something far darker. The revelation that Long Island's southern shoreline had become a dumping ground. Human remains surfaced like grim artifacts, bones hidden in brambles, torsos without heads, skulls found miles from the bodies they belonged to. The neat, chilling uniformity of the Gilgo Four gave way to chaos. Whoever was responsible had not always been consistent. Among the discoveries was Jessica Taylor. She had vanished in 2003, her body dismembered, parts found first in Manorville and later at Gilgo Beach. Valerie Mack, missing since 2000, emerged from the files as another victim when DNA confirmed her remains, also split between Manorville and the coast. Their cases had once floated as unsolved fragments. Now, They were woven into the expanding web. And then came the most haunting discovery. A woman known only as Peaches, identified years later as Tanya Denise Jackson, and a toddler, Baby Doe, her daughter Tatiana, a mother and child reduced to nicknames in police reports, their lives abbreviated by brutality. For 2 decades, their identities were lost, as though the world had collectively decided they were too inconvenient to name. It was DNA technology, not diligence, that finally gave them back their voices. The picture that emerged was both clearer and more confusing. Some victims had been wrapped in burlap, others dismembered. Some were buried close together, others scattered across miles. The variations raised a chilling question. Was this all the work of one man? Or had Gilgo Beach become the graveyard of multiple predators? Investigators argued. Experts debated. The public speculated endlessly. Meanwhile, the family sat with grief that no theory could resolve. Gilgo Beach itself became a character in the story. A stretch of sand once reserved for summer picnics and late-night bonfires was rebranded in headlines as a mass grave. Every gust of wind seemed to carry whispers. Every tide threatened to reveal something new. Residents who once saw the beach as a sanctuary now approached it with unease. It was no longer a backdrop for childhood memories. It was a reminder of how much horror can be hidden just out of sight. For law enforcement, the discoveries were overwhelming. Each body meant new evidence, new families to notify, new leads to chase. But each body also meant new pressure. Why hadn't this been uncovered earlier? Why had so many women gone missing without raising alarms? Questions piled up faster than answers, and suspicion began to fall not just on a faceless killer, but on the system itself. By the time the searches wound down in 2011, the tally of victims connected to Gilgo Beach stood at 11. 11 sets of remains, spanning decades. 11 lives reduced to case files, press conferences, and speculation. And still, no suspect. The cemetery in the sand had spoken, but it had not named its monster. That would take years of silence, frustration, and stalled investigations before the mask finally slipped. By early 2011, the beaches of Long Island had given up their grim harvest. 11 sets of remains, 4 of them neatly bound in burlap, others scattered and incomplete. The question wasn't just who could do such a thing, it was also how it had gone unnoticed for so long. And inevitably, the spotlight shifted to the Suffolk County Police Department. The press conferences grew tense. Uniformed officials stood behind podiums, speaking in the careful language of damage control. We are pursuing all leads. We have no evidence of an active threat to the community. Translation: we have no idea who did this, but please keep paying your property taxes. Reporters were not impressed. Neither were the families. Behind the scenes, the problems were piling up. Evidence had been mishandled. Leads had been missed. In some cases, calls from victims' families had been brushed aside, as though young women could vanish without consequence. The uncomfortable truth was that law enforcement hadn't treated these disappearances with urgency until the bodies began appearing in the sand. And by then, the killer, or killers, had enjoyed years of freedom. Accusations of incompetence soon turned into whispers of corruption. Some suspected that police had deliberately looked the other way. The then police chief, James Burke, didn't help matters. Burke would later resign in disgrace after being convicted of beating a man who stole pornography and sex toys from his car. Not exactly the kind of resume that inspires public confidence. With a leadership like that, it was hard to believe the Gilgo investigation had ever been a top priority. Meanwhile, the families of the victims demanded answers. Press conferences were interrupted by mothers and sisters demanding to know why their calls for help had been ignored years earlier. The gap between law enforcement's cautious statements and the raw grief of those who had lost loved ones was impossible to bridge. And then came the politics. Serial killers don't just create fear, they create reputational crises. Long Island prided itself on being safe, suburban, ordinary. Nobody wanted its name synonymous with unsolved murders. Pressure came down from all sides. Solve the case, restore the image, make the headlines stop. But solving the case is not something that can be done on command. And so the investigation limped on, bogged down by bureaucracy, scandal, and public distrust. For the community, it felt like betrayal. People could accept the idea of a killer hiding in the reeds. They could not accept the idea of a police force stumbling in circles while the body count grew. Suburban life depends on trust, in neighbors, in fences, in the authorities who are supposed to keep order. When that trust cracks, everything feels unstable. By 2012, the search had gone cold. Theories multiplied, documentaries were produced, podcasts speculated. Everyone had an opinion. One killer, two killers, maybe more. But the people with the power to end the nightmare had little more than circumstantial evidence and unanswered questions. The pressure never truly lifted. It sat over Suffolk County like a storm cloud, a constant reminder that the system had failed. And every year that passed without an arrest made the silence louder. It would take a decade, a new wave of technology, and a fresh set of investigators before the pieces finally began to fit together. But back in those years, the picture was simple. The police were under pressure, the families were heartbroken, and the killer, whoever he was, had time on his side. The investigation into the Gilgo murders coincided with a strange moment in technological history. Too modern to vanish completely, too outdated to leave the kind of digital fingerprints detectives rely on today. It was the perfect storm for dead ends. Take DNA, for example. In the early 2000s, forensic science had made huge strides, but it wasn't foolproof. Rootless hairs, degraded samples, trace evidence picked up from beaches and marshes. They were all collected, catalogued, and then filed under inconclusive. The technology simply couldn't say what everyone wanted it to. This hair belonged to this man. So evidence sat in freezers, technically preserved, practically useless. Phones were no better. Victims had them, killers used them, but call records in the early days were patchy and often discarded after a short time. Disposable burner phones, the kind that could be bought at a corner shop with cash, left almost no trail. Investigators later admitted that crucial records had been lost, corrupted, or never properly logged. Imagine chasing a ghost armed with nothing but fragments of voicemails and vague cell tower data. Financial records offered little clarity. Credit cards, bank statements, transactions that might have mapped movements were either overlooked or dismissed as irrelevant at the time. Looking back, some detectives grimly acknowledged that clues had probably passed right under their noses. But in the fog of an ongoing case, everything looks like background noise until you know what you're searching for. And then there was the internet. By the mid-2000s, Craigslist and other online platforms had become meeting points for sex workers and clients. Ads went up, calls were made, appointments arranged. But unlike today's digital landscape, these interactions left only faint traces. IP addresses, user accounts, screen names, all easily disposable and rarely preserved by companies for long. What might now be a breadcrumb trail was then little more than static. All of this meant that the investigation, despite its high stakes, frequently hit walls. Evidence pointed in directions that couldn't be proven. Leads fizzled out. Forensic reports were stacked with inconclusive stamps. Families were told investigators were doing everything possible, though possible in practice meant waiting for science to catch up. Meanwhile, time passed. Technology advanced, but the damage was done. Records that might have broken the case wide open were long gone, erased by policy, neglect, or sheer bad luck. Each year that slipped by made the killer's shadow harder to pin down. It wasn't until the 2020s that a new wave of forensic methods, whole genome sequencing, advanced DNA analysis, breathed life into the old evidence boxes. Suddenly, hairs that had once been labeled worthless became potential keys. But that revelation came decades too late for the families who had spent years in limbo, waiting for answers that technology couldn't yet deliver. Back in the 2000s, the detectives on the Gilgo case were stuck in a labyrinth of partial truths. They had bones without matches, phones without owners, and timelines that refused to align. Every path seemed to lead nowhere. And all the while, the killer walked free, perfectly shielded by the limits of the very science designed to catch him. After 2010, Long Island entered a new kind of limbo. The discovery of the Gilgo 4 and then the others had made one thing undeniable. Someone was hunting women and leaving their bodies by the sea. But the absence of a suspect meant the fear didn't fade. It lingered, year after year, like the damp salt air rolling in from the Atlantic. Theories multiplied. Was it one killer or several? Were the burlap-wrapped bodies and the dismembered torsos the work of the same hand, or of different predators using the same stretch of coastline? Law enforcement publicly hedged their bets, offering carefully phrased statements that sounded reassuring while answering nothing. The public filled in the blanks with gossip, speculation, and late-night internet rabbit holes. For residents, daily life carried on, but the unease was never far away. Walking the dog along the dunes no longer felt innocent. Parents warned their daughters not to go out alone, as if the monster could be lurking behind every fence. Suburban routines, baseball practice, grocery shopping, school drop-offs carried on with the strange weight of knowing that safety was, at best, a performance. The victims themselves became part of the tension. Many had been sex workers, women living on the margins. This fact was reported endlessly, as though repeating it somehow explained their fate. To some, it made the crimes easier to compartmentalize. Tragic, yes, but not something that could touch the rest of the community. That illusion didn't last. The longer the case dragged on, the clearer it became. If someone could kill repeatedly, hide the evidence in plain sight, and never get caught, then nobody was really safe. The press capitalized on the unease. True crime specials ran in cycles, splashing the words Long Island serial killer across screens. Each new theory, no matter how flimsy, made headlines. Podcasters picked apart timelines. Amateur sleuths built forums dedicated to the case, trading maps, theories, and grainy aerial photos, as though they could crack what seasoned investigators could not. The story refused to die, because the killer refused to appear. And through it all, Gilgo Beach itself became a place of morbid fascination. Tourists came not for the sand and surf, but for the chance to stand where the bodies were found. Locals resented the intrusion, but couldn't quite look away themselves. The beach was no longer just a beach. It was a stage where horror had played out, and everyone wanted to walk across it. Fear, like sand, has a way of getting into everything. It coated conversations, seeped into suburban pride, and reshaped Long Island's identity. No longer simply a commuter belt or a vacation spot, it was branded in headlines as the hunting ground of an uncaught killer. For years, that fear sat like a shadow over every barbecue, every block party, every trip to the shore, and still, the investigation crawled. Leads fizzled, technology lagged, families waited. The killer remained anonymous, blending into the ordinary life of Long Island, hiding in plain sight. Nobody guessed that one of those ordinary lives, the tall architect commuting from Massapequa Park, was the man they were all whispering about. But time has a way of shifting things. By the 2020s, new tools, new leadership, and a renewed determination would finally begin to pull the threads together. And as those threads tightened, the mask of the family man began to unravel. By the mid-2000s, the Gilgo Beach case had become a national riddle. True crime podcasts dissected it. Documentaries replayed the same aerial shots of windswept dunes, and the Suffolk County Police issued press conferences that said very little in very serious tones. Everyone wanted to know who the Long Island serial killer was. Nobody pointed to Rex Heuermann. Why would they? He didn't fit the profile, at least not the profile the public had in mind. Serial killers were supposed to be drifters, loners, men with hollow eyes who avoided responsibility and never held down a job. Rex, by contrast, had a family, a career, and a mortgage. He was a 6'4" architect with thick glasses and a wardrobe that suggested thrift store clearance rack. If anything, he looked like the guy who would spend 10 minutes explaining fire codes at a town hall meeting. By day, he worked in Manhattan, commuting into the city like thousands of others. He specialized in office spaces and mundane design projects, earning a reputation as a competent, if uninspired professional. Nothing glamorous, nothing notorious. The kind of man you forget immediately after shaking his hand, which, as it turns out, is perfect cover. At home in Massapequa Park, he lived with his second wife and 2 children in a modest house that blended into the suburban scenery. Neighbors described him in all the cliches of hindsight. Quiet, polite, maybe a bit strange. Some recalled awkward attempts at conversation, others remembered his size. A looming figure in a place that preferred small talk and invisibility. Nobody suspected him of anything more sinister than perhaps being socially clumsy. Yet behind this mask of ordinariness, prosecutors say, he was leading a double life. Disposable phones, online searches for sex workers, and an alleged pattern of violence that stretched back decades. It was the banality of his public persona that made it all possible. Nobody looks twice at the boring guy with the briefcase. The irony is almost painful. For years, police and amateur sleuths chased theories of a phantom killer, a shadowy figure slipping through the reeds at night. All the while, Rex was catching commuter trains, paying property taxes, and nodding to neighbors on garbage day. The predator wasn't hiding in the darkness. He was standing under the brightest lights, disguised as everything people considered safe. By the time his name finally appeared in investigative files, he had already walked free for decades. The suspect who haunted Long Island lived not in whispers or rumors, but in a tan suburban house with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. Hardly the lair of a criminal mastermind, yet somehow the perfect stage for one. The arrival of Rex in the story changes everything. Suddenly, the faceless monster of Gilgo Beach had a body, a name, a resume, a family. The mask of suburbia had cracked, and the shock was only beginning. Because once you know his name, the question shifts. It's no longer who is the Long Island serial killer, but how on earth did he get away with it for so long? If the 1990s had been Rex Heuermann's playground of anonymity, the 2000s and 2010s were trickier. The world had gone digital, and while that made hunting easier, it also meant leaving breadcrumbs. Heuermann left plenty, though for years, nobody bothered to follow them. Investigators later revealed the details, and they read like a manual for a man living a double life. Burner phones, dozens of them, purchased with cash, activated, used briefly, then tossed aside. Each one linked to calls with escorts, carefully compartmentalized from his family man persona. He would arrange meetings, sometimes cycling through numbers so often it resembled the work of a paranoid spy. Except his mission wasn't espionage. It was darker and far more mundane. Then there were the internet searches. Once investigators finally gained access to his devices, the results were almost cartoonishly incriminating. Queries like how to stop your wife from finding out you're seeing sex workers sat side by side with torture porn and best escort websites in New York. Some searches were so bizarre, they sounded like the paranoid mutterings of a man who didn't quite understand how Google works. If he wasn't a killer, he was certainly a cautionary tale about what not to type into a search bar. Still, for years, these trails remained invisible. Phone records disappeared into corporate voids. Search histories were private until warrants cracked them open. Heuermann must have believed the burners and the endless parade of internet aliases made him untouchable. And in a way, he was right. For over a decade, nobody caught him. The irony is that technology, the very thing he thought shielded him, eventually betrayed him. New forensic tools pulled DNA from old hairs once thought worthless. Cell tower data, primitive in 2010, was reanalyzed with modern precision, placing his burners in the same locations as victims. The digital dust he had scattered, confident it would vanish, was quietly waiting to be reassembled. But hindsight is cruel. At the time, the red flags were buried in the noise of countless data points. To investigators in the 2000s, Rex Heuermann was still just another name in a sea of irrelevance. Only in the 2020s, when new teams revisited old files, did the digital trail glow like neon. The image that emerges is not of a criminal mastermind, but of a clumsy man with just enough discipline to hide in plain sight, and just enough arrogance to believe he always would. His burners were his shield. His searches were his secret. His suburban mask kept suspicion at bay. And yet, all of it was written down in code and call logs, waiting for someone to connect the dots, waiting for the illusion to collapse. When it finally did, it wasn't just the end of his secrecy. It was the end of the myth that he was untouchable. Because once detectives had the trail, it led them directly to his door. By the late 2000s, the Gilgo investigation had become the very definition of a cold case. The files were thick, the theories endless, and public patience long gone. But then came a shift. New leadership, new forensic tools, and crucially, new eyes on old evidence. Where earlier detectives had seen dead ends, the new team began to notice patterns. And those patterns kept pointing back to one name, Rex Heuermann. It started with the phones. Investigators re-examined the tower data tied to the burner phones used to contact the victims. Primitive in 2010, the records were nearly useless at the time. But with modern analysis, the signals painted a clearer picture. Several of those phones had pinged towers not far from Heuermann's home in Massapequa Park, and others traced routes consistent with his daily commute into Manhattan. The ghostly dots on a map suddenly looked like a man's daily routine. Then came the DNA. Hairs collected years earlier, Hairs so degraded they had once been labeled inconclusive were reanalyzed using advanced techniques. The results were quietly astonishing. A strand found on one victim's body matched mitochondrial DNA from Heuermann's wife. Not proof he was the killer, but proof that someone from his household had been there. Another hair, found on a burlap sack, pointed directly to him. The evidence was stacking like bricks, each one narrowing the walls around him. Surveillance was the next step. Detectives watched him, followed him, gathered his discarded bottles and pizza crusts for DNA swabs. The kind of slow, methodical work that feels boring until it snaps shut, like a trap. Each new sample confirmed what they had begun to suspect. The architect with the awkward smile and oversized glasses was hiding far more than suburban mediocrity. Meanwhile, prosecutors built the narrative. They didn't just want suspicion, they wanted certainty. They compiled records of his internet searches, his burner phones, his movements. They layered it with witness testimony, financial data, even scraps of his online behavior. By the time the file was finished, it wasn't a stack of maybes. It was a portrait, grim, detailed, undeniable. All of this unfolded in silence. While Heuermann carried on with his life, commuting, working, living under the illusion that his secrets were still buried, investigators were quietly dismantling his mask piece by piece. The man who once believed he was invisible was suddenly surrounded, every detail of his double life catalogued and preserved for court. By July 2023, the case was airtight enough to move. Prosecutors were ready, detectives were ready. The neighborhood was not. And when the arrest finally came, it felt both shocking and inevitable. The banality of suburbia had hidden a predator for decades. Now, the system that had failed so long was finally about to deliver. July 13th, 2023. The day Massapequa Park woke up and realized its sleepy suburb had been living with a headline in human form. The morning began like any other. Sprinklers ticking, commuters cursing traffic, kids dragging themselves to summer programs. Then came the sirens. Marked cars lined the street like chess pieces. Unmarked vans blocked the view, and neighbors gathered on porches with the kind of excitement usually reserved for holiday parades. Only this parade had handcuffs and detectives instead of floats. Out of the tan house came Rex Heuermann, flanked by officers, his massive frame hunched as though he hoped shrinking 2 feet might make him less recognizable. Spoiler, it didn't. He looked ordinary, painfully so. Khakis, glasses, a half-crushed expression on his face, more office drone than alleged serial killer. And yet here he was, accused of murdering at least 7 women, possibly more, and leaving their remains in burlap along Long Island's beaches. The mask of dull suburban life was gone. In its place stood the man tabloids were already branding the butcher of Gilgo Beach. The cameras clicked like a firing squad. News crews shoved microphones at stunned neighbors who, without fail, delivered the same lines. He was quiet, kept to himself. We never suspected a thing. A few scrambled for anecdotes to make it sound like hindsight. One neighbor swore he always found him odd. Another muttered, "He waved at Christmas but never stayed to chat." Hardly the stuff of clairvoyance, but in the glare of national news, everyone wanted a line. For the families of the victims, the arrest was a brutal vindication. After more than a decade of unanswered questions, here was a man in cuffs, a face to attach to the horror. Relief mixed with grief. Closure was promised but not yet delivered. Each charge filed was a reminder that their daughters, sisters, mothers would not be coming back. Inside the police vans, the mood was different. Detectives who had spent years watching the case stagnate finally had their moment. The evidence, the burners, the DNA, the surveillance had converged. Heuermann wasn't just a name on a list anymore. He was in custody, his suburban camouflage stripped away. And for the public, the spectacle was irresistible. Within hours, Heuermann's mugshot was everywhere. A grim, unsmiling portrait of a man who looked more like a grumpy accountant than a killer. The internet did what it always does, dissecting his appearance in memes, debating his guilt in forums, and speculating wildly about how many victims there might really be. But the arrest was not the end. It was only the prologue to a trial that promised to drag every hidden detail of his life into the light. The neighbors who once ignored him would find themselves interviewed on national television. His family would be forced into the spotlight they never wanted. And the quiet cul-de-sac of Massapequa Park would forever be stamped into history books as the place where the Gilgo Beach killer lived. For now, though, the image was simple. A man in cuffs, escorted past flashing cameras, his long-kept secret finally collapsing under the weight of evidence. And as the van pulled away, the question hung heavier than ever. Was Rex Heuermann the only shadow on Gilgo Beach, or just the one who got caught? If there's one thing the modern world loves more than safety, it's spectacle. The arrest of Rex Heuermann gave it both and neither. Within hours of his July 2023 arrest, his mugshot was plastered across every news site, every true crime forum, every late-night broadcast. He wasn't just a suspect anymore. He was a brand. The headlines wrote themselves: Suburban Dad Turned Serial Killer, Architect of Death, The Gilgo Beach Butcher. Cable anchors spoke in hushed tones, lingering over details like the burlap sacks and the burner phones, as though the repetition itself added meaning. The same aerial shots of Gilgo Beach dunes played on loop, accompanied by solemn piano music, while talking heads speculated with the confidence of people who had never read a case file. True crime podcasts raced to release emergency episodes. Documentaries scrambled to update scripts. Even local news outlets, desperate for clicks, filled segments with neighbors repeating the obvious. He was quiet. He kept to himself. Everyone became an expert overnight. And everyone had a theory. Was he responsible for all 11 bodies? Was there another killer still at large? Could his family really have known nothing? The public devoured it all. Forums filled with amateur sleuths drawing digital maps, connecting dots that may or may not exist. TikTok creators filmed moody montages of Gilgo Beach with ominous soundtracks. The internet does not wait for trials. It creates its own courtroom. In that court, Rex Heuermann was already guilty, already infamous, already transformed into a character in the world's favorite genre, true crime. For Massapequa Park, the circus was unbearable. Residents who had once boasted about the suburb's quiet charm now found their streets swarmed with reporters. Their lawns caught in the background of nightly broadcasts. Strangers drove slowly past the tan house, phones out as though suburban horror were just another tourist attraction. The community that prided itself on anonymity was now immortalized in bold black letters across national headlines. The irony was thick. For over a decade, the Gilgo murders had simmered in frustration, underreported, overshadowed by bigger news cycles. Now, with a suspect in handcuffs, it was everywhere. The same outlets that once ignored the missing women now made careers out of their stories. Families who had begged for attention for years were finally heard. though always framed against the shadow of the accused. Media frenzy has its costs, details blurred into entertainment. The lives of the victims were compressed into sound bites. Heuermann's face, awkward and blank, became a meme. The complexity of the case, the decades of failure, the forensic breakthroughs, the unanswered questions, was flattened into a neat narrative designed to fit into 20-minute segments. And yet, without the frenzy, the story might have faded again. The public obsession kept pressure on investigators, prosecutors, and politicians. It forced the case into the spotlight where it belonged, even if the glare distorted the truth. By the end of that summer, Rex Heuermann wasn't just a man awaiting trial. He was a household name. His story stamped into America's collective imagination. For better or worse, he had joined the pantheon of killers turned cultural fixations. And with the media came another wave, the courtroom. Because spectacle alone isn't enough. Eventually, the story has to stand in front of a judge. The morning of Rex Heuermann's first court appearance looked less like justice in motion and more like the opening of a blockbuster film. Camera crews swarmed the courthouse, reporters lined up as if they were camping for concert tickets, and spectators gathered just to say they'd been there. Long Island had waited over a decade for this moment, and everyone wanted a front row seat. Heuermann, towering as always, shuffled into the courtroom in handcuffs. The image was surreal. A man who had once blended so seamlessly into suburban scenery, now standing under fluorescent lights, flanked by guards, every step recorded from multiple angles. He looked awkward, almost dazed, as if he couldn't quite believe the quiet banality of his life had led here. And yet, here he was, facing charges that carried words like life sentence and serial killer. The prosecution came armed with a mountain of evidence. DNA links from hairs found on victims, burner phone records tracing calls to his home and office, surveillance that showed his routine aligning with the crimes. They didn't just suggest his involvement, they painted him into the picture. Every data point another nail, every forensic test another lock, clicking shut. His defense, on the other hand, leaned heavily on denial. Attorneys reminded the court that DNA evidence could be indirect, that hairs could transfer innocently, that circumstantial evidence was not certainty. They painted Heuermann as an easy scapegoat, a large, awkward man who happened to live near the crime scenes. To hear them tell it, the state had simply decided to fit him for a monster's mask because they were tired of looking. The families of the victims filled the benches, their presence a quiet counterweight to the arguments. Every time a name was read aloud, you could feel the air tighten. For them, this wasn't about data or legal nuance, it was about stolen lives, years of silence, and the possibility of justice finally reaching across time. Meanwhile, the media did what it always does, turn the courtroom into theatre. Sketches of Heuermann's posture, analysis of his expression, breakdowns of his every word. Did he look remorseful? Defiant? Terrified? The truth hardly mattered. The performance was the product, and everyone had an opinion. What struck many observers was the ordinariness of it all. There was no grand revelation, no cinematic confession, just lawyers in suits, evidence presented with clinical precision, and a man in oversized glasses listening as his life was recast as a catalogue of horrors. It was less law and order and more paperwork with fluorescent lighting. Yet beneath that dull surface, lives and reputations hung in the balance. As the hearings unfolded, the weight of the case became clear. This wasn't going to be quick. It wasn't going to be simple. It would be years of motions, appeals, and arguments, each step dissected by the public as though every filing were a plot twist. The courtroom drama had only just begun. And like every long-running production, the real question wasn't whether it would grip the audience. It was how long they could bear to watch. If the arrest was a shock to Long Island, it was an earthquake inside the Heuermann household. In the days after Rex was led out of his home in handcuffs, the story turned to the people left standing in the wreckage, his wife, Asa, and his 2 children. Until then, they had been the anonymous supporting cast in a suburban script. Overnight, they became unwilling characters in a national spectacle. The questions were immediate, blunt, and cruel. Did they know? Could they have known? The idea that someone could live under the same roof as a suspected serial killer without seeing the cracks was unthinkable to the public. Yet to those who understand masks like Rex's, it made perfect sense. Monsters don't announce themselves at breakfast. They don't leave burlap sacks in the garage. They mow the lawn, argue about bills, and tuck their children into bed. Ordinary is the perfect hiding place. Asa wasted no time filing for divorce. The marriage that had seemed like stability was suddenly revealed as collateral damage. She kept her distance from the courthouse, from the cameras, from the narrative that cast her as the wife of the Gilgo Beach killer. It wasn't just self-preservation, it was survival. Because how do you defend yourself against a story you never asked to be part of? The children, teenagers at the time, were dragged into the chaos unwillingly. School became impossible. Friends became scarce. Social media, merciless as always, turned their father's arrest into a meme factory. Each new headline a fresh reminder of what had been stolen from them. Their anonymity, their innocence, their belief that their father was just awkward, not monstrous. Neighbors, once politely indifferent, now whispered loudly. Some offered pity, others suspicion. In suburbs, scandal spreads faster than weeds, and the Heuermann family found themselves living under a microscope they never volunteered for. Their home, once a bland tan house, indistinguishable from the others, became a landmark. Strangers slowed their cars to take photos. Tourists came to stare. Privacy evaporated. The fallout wasn't just personal. Financially, the family was devastated. The breadwinner was behind bars, their house became both crime scene and spectacle, and their names, once invisible, were inked into every article about the case. In the court of public opinion, they were guilty by association, forced to live in the long shadow of accusations they had no part in. And yet, amid the chaos, their silence spoke volumes. Asa and the children gave few interviews, refused to be props in the endless cycle of media frenzy. Their absence from the narrative was its own kind of protest, a refusal to let the crimes of one man dictate the lives of the people he left behind. But the damage was irreversible. The Heuermanns were no longer just another suburban family. They were the family of the alleged Gilgo Beach killer. Every move they made, every word they spoke, would forever be filtered through that lens. And in that sense, Rex's crimes didn't just take the lives of his victims. They destroyed his own families as well. Not with violence, but with exposure. Because sometimes the fallout of a monster's mask cracking is that everyone standing behind it gets burned. Once a name exists, people start counting. After Rex Heuermann's arrest, the question that had lingered for years became a chorus. How many? 7 charges were listed with legal neatness, like items on a grim invoice. But the shoreline and the archives suggested something messier. The number was a rumor with a pulse. For families with unsolved cases across Long Island and beyond, the headlines landed like a key rattling in the wrong lock. Old photographs came back out of drawers. FOIA requests multiplied. Detectives received emails beginning with, I know this is a long shot. Each message contained a story that sounded familiar in all the worst ways. A daughter who didn't call, a last text from an unfamiliar number, a final appointment arranged by someone hiding behind a disposable phone. The past, it turned out, was full of trails that had been too faint to follow until someone gave them a name. The geography didn't help. Remains had been found in more than one location: dunes, marsh, bramble, and in other cases, deeper inland. Some victims had been left intact, others dismembered and dispersed like a cruel arithmetic problem. This lack of consistency spawned a persistent theory. Maybe there wasn't just one killer. Maybe Gilgo Beach had become a dump site for more than a decade, used by more than one predator who believed the ocean and the bureaucracy would erase their work. Comforting thought, really. If by comforting you mean twice the nightmare. Then there was time. The recognized timeline stretched backward, past the 2010 discoveries, beyond the mid-2000s, into the early 90s and maybe earlier. With each year added, the pool of possible cases widened. Some looked compatible with the alleged pattern, others were like warped reflections, close enough to tempt, different enough to mislead. Experts argued. Families waited. The internet turned itself into a jury box with no recess. And the labels, those labels, sex worker, runaway, high-risk lifestyle, bureaucratic categories that, for years, had served as a quiet excuse to deprioritize urgent cases. Now, those same words were being reread like clues. A belated attempt to map indifference onto intent. The truth was simpler and uglier. Predators target the unprotected, and systems often oblige them. Rumors grew legs. A cluster of cases from one township became a thread. A similar MO 2 counties away became a tapestry. A phone ping here, a missing call log there, a photograph linked to an escort ad that had been deleted a lifetime ago. These fragments formed a story that might be true or might be wishful scaffolding built on grief. Law enforcement, mindful of courtrooms rather than comment sections, kept their answers careful. We're reviewing potential connections. Translation: we cannot promise you the closure you deserve, but we cannot dismiss the possibility either. What made the speculation particularly stubborn was the technology curve. Back when some of these women vanished, forensic tools were blunt instruments. Evidence gathered then, hairs, without roots, fibers without context, partial profiles that couldn't stand in court, had been boxed and preserved, the scientific equivalent of hope. With newer methods, those boxes had begun to talk. Not loudly, not consistently, but enough to suggest that the archive still held names waiting to be spoken. For the public, this created a paradox. The more the science advanced, the more uncertainty expanded. Each new technique felt like a promise, but every promise came with caveats. Contamination risks, statistical margins, the cold reality that a match can illuminate a path without proving who walked it. Courts are allergic to maybes. Families are starved for one yes. And so the whispering continued. 7 charged, 11 found in that first sweep, others scattered in the records like dropped pins on a bad map. Street-level memory insisted the true number was higher. Survivors who never reported and families who never stopped calling agreed. Even the beach seemed to agree. Wind crossing the dunes with a sound like paper being turned in a file no one had finished reading. Which leaves the question not as a headline, but as a weight. Are we looking at the total, or just the visible portion of a much larger shape beneath the surface? The only honest answer sits inside those boxes, in sealed envelopes and old swabs, in evidence that was once declared useless and is suddenly interesting again. Because if there is a route to the real number, it won't come from rumors or message boards. It will come from chemistry and math, the quiet, unglamorous work that takes years and refuses to care about ratings. And that work, finally, had begun to change the case. Next, we open the boxes. For years, the Gilgo evidence lockers were little more than mausoleums of disappointment. Bags of hairs, fibers, and microscopic scraps sat in climate-controlled silence, each tagged and filed with grim precision, each stamped with the investigator's least favorite word: inconclusive. The samples were too degraded, too partial, too uncooperative to tell their secrets. At least that was true in 2010. Science had other plans. By the 2020s, DNA analysis had moved beyond the simple does it match or doesn't it binary. Mitochondrial testing, whole genome sequencing, even genealogical databases had turned once useless samples into potential keys. Hairs without roots, long dismissed as evidence without a voice, could now hum a genetic tune, subtle but distinctive enough to point in the right direction. Investigators revisited the Gilgo files with this new arsenal. One hair, recovered from the burlap that had wrapped a victim, was retested. The result didn't just float vaguely in the realm of probabilities. It aligned directly with Rex Heuermann. Another hair collected from a victim's body pointed toward his wife's mitochondrial DNA, a statistical match that placed his household, if not him personally, at the crime scene. Suddenly the worthless had become damning. The irony was brutal. For more than a decade, families were told the science wasn't there yet, that patience was required. And patience, as it turned out, was exactly what the killer relied on. Heuermann could continue living his bland double life because technology hadn't caught up. When it finally did, the mask slipped not through confession or witness testimony, but through the quiet persistence of molecules. Of course, breakthroughs don't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't just the science, it was the people willing to revisit cold cases with fresh eyes. A task force combed through evidence, long thought exhausted, rerunning tests, cross-referencing results, and, crucially, pairing genetic whispers with digital footprints. The DNA didn't solve the case alone, but it narrowed the focus until only one silhouette remained standing. For prosecutors, this was gold. Unlike speculation or witness memory, DNA didn't forget, didn't contradict itself, and didn't have credibility issues. It just sat there, stubborn and silent, until someone invented the right machine to make it speak. And when it spoke, it pointed toward the man in Massapequa Park who had blended in so successfully for so long. The breakthrough changed everything. What had once been a wall of circumstantial evidence, phone pings, suspicious searches, strange commutes, suddenly had biological teeth. It transformed the case from intriguing to prosecutable. The narrative was no longer "we think he fits," but his DNA is here. In a courtroom, that shift is seismic. For the families, the breakthroughs were bittersweet. Proof was satisfying, yes, but it also reopened wounds. Every hair, every fragment was a reminder of what had been done to their loved ones. Justice, when it finally moved, came with a sting. And yet, the message was clear. Science had caught up. The beach had whispered its secrets years earlier, but only now did technology translate them. The killer who thought time was his shield discovered too late that time was also the weapon that would undo him. Next comes the grind of turning breakthroughs into convictions. The long, brutal theatre of the trial. By September 2025, the Gilgo case had stopped being just a local nightmare and turned into a legal spectacle with national implications. The courthouse wasn't merely preparing to put Rex Heuermann on trial, it was preparing to test the boundaries of science itself. The latest pre-trial hearings looked less like routine motions and more like a duel between centuries. On one side, prosecutors armed with whole genome sequencing, the kind of forensic tool that would have sounded like science fiction back when the first bodies were discovered. On the other, Heuermann's defense, branding it all as magic, not the helpful kind of magic, mind you, more like the smoke and mirrors variety. Dangerous because it could sway a jury with its gloss of certainty. The irony was thick. For more than a decade, families had been told that the evidence, the hairs, the fibers, the faint traces, was too degraded to matter. Now, in 2025, the same samples were suddenly star witnesses. Prosecutors insisted that DNA pulled from belts, tape, and burlap didn't just whisper, but shouted, Rex Heuermann was there. Not in some vague statistical sense, but matched across 6 victims, stretching back to 1993. The defense, meanwhile, clung to process. The lab that performed the testing, they argued, wasn't licensed in New York State. The evidence violated public health law, they said. The science was cutting edge, which in their telling was just another word for unproven. They wanted it tossed out, erased, treated as if the molecules had never spoken. The judge now found himself not only ruling on one man's fate, but setting precedent. If the DNA stood, it would be the first time such whole genome testing was admitted in an American murder trial. The courtroom was suddenly a laboratory, and the outcome would ripple far beyond Long Island. Heuermann sat through all of this in his usual posture, silent, awkward, almost bored. His lawyers spoke of violations, loopholes, and licensing. Prosecutors spoke of statistics, probabilities, and strands of hair that refused to disappear. Somewhere between the two, his family's wreckage and his victims' ghosts filled the room in silence. Outside, the media had their field day. Magic DNA, one tabloid declared, as though wizards had been subpoenaed. Others called it the trial of the future. The coverage was less about Heuermann himself and more about the collision between old crimes and new science. The headlines made him seem almost secondary, a stand-in for every cold case waiting in evidence boxes across America. And yet, beneath the spectacle, the stakes were as old as justice itself. If the evidence stood, prosecutors would walk into trial with 6 victims, tied directly to him by the most intimate of witnesses, their own biology. If the evidence fell, the case risked wobbling back toward circumstantial, a house of cards in a storm. For the families, the argument over science wasn't academic, it was personal. Each legal motion was another reminder of how fragile justice can be, how easily it bends under the weight of procedure. They didn't care if the method was licensed, patented, or invented yesterday. They cared that it pointed finally to the man who had stolen so much. As the judge prepared to rule, the courtroom was suspended between 2 futures, one where the trial proceeds with the force of science behind it, and one where the evidence is dismissed as trickery. Either way, the stage was set. The trial of Rex Heuermann wasn't just about murders on a beach, it was about how truth itself is measured. And the jury, when they finally sit, will be asked to decide whether science is magic, or whether magic is just the word guilty men use when facts refuse to vanish. If the courtroom was a battleground of science versus procedure, the streets and screens outside were an even louder arena. In 2025, no trial exists in isolation. Every filing, every quote, every grainy photo of Rex Heuermann being led to court was dissected in real time, judged not just by lawyers, but by millions of spectators armed with Wi-Fi and opinions. The phrase magic DNA spread faster than any prosecutor could hope to keep up with. For some, it became a punchline, memes of wizards in lab coats, Harry Potter jokes pasted over crime scene tape. For others, it was terrifying. The idea that an invisible, complex technology could condemn a man without the average person understanding how it worked. Social media thrives on that tension, and the Gilgo case delivered in spades. On TikTok, self-appointed experts posted dramatic voiceovers about genomic sequencing, as though they just invented the field. Reddit threads ballooned into thousands of comments, with half the participants explaining probabilities and half warning about junk science. Podcasts framed the trial as a battle for the soul of forensic justice. The narrative wasn't just did he do it, but can we trust the science that says he did? Meanwhile, Long Island residents carried their own burden of opinion. To many, the DNA was a relief, the closest thing to certainty they'd seen in a case that had haunted them for decades. For others, skepticism persisted, not out of sympathy for Heuermann, but out of fatigue. They had watched police missteps, corruption scandals, and years of silence. Why should this be different? Trust, once lost, is hard to summon, even when molecules are talking. For the families of the victims, public opinion was salt on a wound. Each headline about magic or groundbreaking science threatened to eclipse what really mattered: the women who were gone. Their names risked being reduced once again to case numbers, their stories flattened into backdrops for legal theatrics. Some family members embraced the media, speaking at rallies, demanding that the focus remain on the human cost. Others retreated, unwilling to see their grief turned into hashtags. And then there was Rex himself, or at least the image of him. Mugshots and court sketches circulated with commentary that veered between horror and ridicule. He looks like a monster. He looks like an accountant. He looks like every guy in line at the DMV. The ordinariness of his appearance made the story stick. The alleged predator who blended in too well. Public fascination fed on that contradiction. The banality of evil, rendered in khakis and glasses. The prosecution and defense both knew they weren't just arguing in court, they were arguing in the court of public opinion too. Jurors are instructed to ignore outside noise, but in the age of 24-hour news cycles and infinite scroll, who really can? Each side played carefully to the gallery. Prosecutors framing DNA as truth incarnate, defense lawyers warning of dangerous precedent. It wasn't just about convincing 12 people in a jury box. It was about shaping the narrative that would surround them. Public opinion doesn't decide guilt, but it does decide legacy. The Gilgo case had already secured its place in American crime history. The question now was whether it would be remembered as the triumph of science over secrecy, or as another story warped by sensationalism. And as the trial date loomed, the volume outside only increased. Everyone had chosen a side. Everyone was certain they were right. The only people who hadn't spoken yet were the jurors. The 12 strangers who would soon have to tune out the noise and decide the fate of the man at the center of it all. Before a trial begins, before a single piece of evidence is displayed, or a lawyer clears their throat, there's the ritual of jury selection. Voir dire, a French phrase meaning to speak the truth. In practice, it looks more like speed dating with people's freedom on the line. The Rex Heuermann case was never going to be an ordinary jury pool. The moment potential jurors received their summons, They knew exactly which name would appear at the top of the paperwork. This wasn't some minor fraud case or a neighborhood dispute over fences. This was the Gilgo Beach murders. Try walking into that room without baggage. Lawyers probed for bias with questions that sounded simple, but carried dynamite. Have you heard of the case? Everyone had. Do you believe in the reliability of DNA testing? Half nodded solemnly. The other half muttered about magic. Can you promise to set aside what you've seen in the media? Insert nervous laughter here. The goal wasn't to find people untouched by the story. Such unicorns don't exist in 2025. But to find 12 souls willing to pretend they could ignore the noise. Each side hunted for advantage. The prosecution wanted jurors who trusted science, who could hear words like whole genome sequencing without glazing over. The defense wanted skeptics, people suspicious of government overreach, of labs and licenses, and anything that smelled like new technology. Every raised eyebrow, every awkward pause became evidence in its own right. The candidates themselves bore the tension. Some looked terrified, desperate to be excused from the weight of a case that had dominated headlines for years. Others looked intrigued, imagining themselves as part of history, maybe even a podcast episode down the line. But when the final 12 were chosen, the air shifted. What had been abstract suddenly became crushingly real. Serving on the jury of an alleged serial killer is not glamorous. It is hours of testimony, days of gruesome photographs, weeks of arguments framed in clinical terms. It is the silent pressure of knowing that at the end you will be asked to speak for the state, for the victims, for the accused, and whatever you decide will echo far beyond the courtroom. The irony of the Gilgo jury was obvious. They were being asked to weigh cutting-edge science against human doubt, precision statistics against gut instinct, to sit in judgment not only of one man, but of the very methods used to convict him. Jurors are supposed to be arbiters of fact, not philosophers of technology, but in this case, the line blurred. When the jury box finally filled and the oaths were sworn, the trial ceased to be theoretical. 12 strangers now carried the burden. 12 ordinary lives, plucked from grocery lines and office cubicles, were about to decide whether Rex Heuermann would spend the rest of his life behind bars. And in that moment, the weight shifted again. No longer just science versus magic, no longer just prosecution versus defense. It was now a question for the most fragile system of all: human judgment. The story of Gilgo Beach doesn't end neatly. It sprawls like the coastline itself, with fragments exposed and others still buried in the sand. Rex Heuermann sits accused of 7 murders, tied to 6 victims by DNA, linked to decades of whispers and fear. He pleads not guilty, of course. In his telling, he is a victim of magic science, a man framed by technology he doesn't understand. His lawyers sharpen their arguments, his family lives in exile, and the world waits for the next headline. But even as the case barrels toward trial, the silence of the missing remains heavier than any courtroom. 11 sets of remains found, dozens of unsolved cases still open, families still waiting by phones that will never ring. Each legal motion may decide what evidence is admissible, but none of it rewinds the clock. None of it restores what was taken. For Long Island, the legacy is paradoxical. A place once defined by suburban calm now carries a darker identity. The beach that became a cemetery, the neighborhood that hid a killer in plain sight. Property values may recover, the cameras may move on, but the stain remains. You cannot unknow that horror lived just down the street, disguised in khakis and glasses. The science that broke the silence is itself a character in the story. Whole genome sequencing, once experimental, now stands as the star witness in a trial that will set precedent. If it holds, the future of cold cases across America shifts. If it falters, the Gilgo case risks crumbling back into a house of circumstantial cards. In either outcome, the victims' names will still echo, because technology may speak, but grief never stops talking. And then there's the irony. All of this began with a missing woman in 2010. A search through Reads for Shannon Gilbert that uncovered so much more than anyone imagined. 15 years later, the case has grown into something larger than one man, larger than one community. It is a mirror held up to the failures of police, the resilience of families, the arrogance of predators, and the slow, stubborn march of science. Perhaps one day a verdict will deliver finality. Perhaps the whispers of more victims will fade into confirmations or dismissals. But for now, the Gilgo Beach murders remain suspended in a strange in-between, part solved, part mystery, entirely haunting. Because when you strip away the headlines, the science, the spectacle, what lingers is this: a line of names carved into public memory, a community that lost its innocence, and a silence that can never quite be filled. And that sleepless rabble was the saga of Gilgo Beach, a story of suburbia, sand, and silence that turned into one of the darkest crime tapestries America has ever woven. From the first missing call to the courtroom battles of today, it's a reminder that evil doesn't lurk in shadows alone. Sometimes it mows its lawn right next to you. If you've made it this far, let me take a second to thank you for staying with me in the quiet. Stories like this aren't entertainment, not really. They're echoes of real lives, and they stick with you long after the credits roll. Now, if you want to keep wandering through the darker corners of history and humanity with me, you know the drill. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment. And here's the question for you tonight. What disaster should we transform into the next story for you? A forgotten scandal, a historical catastrophe, maybe a true crime tale that still keeps you awake at night? Throw your ideas into the comments. Your whispers might just become our next lullaby of horror. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you've just listened to The Gilgo Beach Murders, a suburban nightmare. Sleep tight, if you can.